in the winter of 1887, inside a farmhouse on the edge of Harlan County, Kentucky. A work crew hired to restore an old stone hearth stopped their labor around mid-morning and refused to re-enter the building. The foreman, Elias Prout, submitted a brief written account to the county clerk 3 days later. It wasn't a complaint or a legal filing, just a statement. He wanted something on record before word spread, before rumors drifted too far in the wrong direction. The statement described what the men uncovered as they removed the stones from the fireplace's back wall, a narrow passage, so tight that a full-grown man would have to turn sideways to enter. It descended at a slight angle into the ground beneath the house. Prout noted 2 specific reasons his men wouldn't continue. First, the passage had been sealed from the inside. Second, along the left wall, at about chest height, someone had carved a series of markings, not letters or numbers, repeating at regular intervals, as if keeping some kind of tally. The county clerk stamped the document and filed it away. The folder was lost sometime over the following decade. The farmhouse changed hands 4 more times before anyone thought to question why the fireplace's back wall had been so poorly rebuilt, and why the mortar used on that single section was 20 years newer than the rest. Before we go deeper into the story of the Harlan County farmhouse and the passage never meant to be found, if you're new here, welcome. We explore the darkest, most unsettling corners of American history. Subscribe so you don't miss a story like this. Hit the notification bell, and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from tonight. The truth about what lay beneath that farmhouse didn't surface all at once. It came in fragments, the way most grim things do. A document here, a name there, a detail that only made sense when placed beside 3 others no one had thought to connect. What follows is the story of a house, a hidden corridor, and the human choices that made both necessary, choices a family carried in utter silence for decades. For reasons that, once understood, reveal something deeply unsettling about the specific moment in American history when the passage saw its heaviest use. Harlan County sits in southeastern Kentucky, pressed against the Virginia line by a ridge of mountains that made it one of the most isolated pockets of the Appalachian interior for most of the 19th century. The Cumberland Mountains didn't just surround the county. They defined it. They shaped who could enter and who could leave, how quickly news traveled, and how long a secret could stay buried before the earth gave it up. To understand the farmhouse on Poor Fork, you first have to grasp what Kentucky represented in the decades before the Civil War and in the years that followed. The state occupied a position that was geographic before it was political. A border state, slave, holding but not seceded, southern in its agricultural economy and many of its social arrangements, yet pressed against Ohio and Indiana to the north. Free states where the law operated differently. The Ohio River, forming Kentucky's northern boundary, was more than a geographic feature. For tens of thousands of people, it was the most critical line on any map. Crossing it meant one thing. Failing to cross meant something else entirely. But eastern Kentucky, tucked in its mountains, was not the Ohio River. It wasn't a quick dash across open water to the opposite shore. It was 100 miles of ridges and creek valleys, of settlements days apart on horseback in good weather and impassable in bad, of communities where everyone knew everyone, and a stranger's presence was noted and discussed. Moving through this landscape required help. It required people who knew which routes were watched and which weren't, which families could be trusted and which couldn't, which farms had root cellars deep enough to offer shelter for a night and which had neighbors too close to risk it. In the decades before the Civil War, One of those farms was the Cornett place on Poor Fork. Harlan County in the 1840s was coal country in name only. The seams were there, running dark and thick beneath the ridges, but the infrastructure to extract them on a large scale hadn't yet arrived. What the county had in abundance was farmland, carved from hollows and creek bottoms, a scattering of small communities tied to family lines. Clover Fork, Cranks Creek, Yoakum Branch, and a population that had been there long enough to develop the particular insularity of people who learned to solve their own problems quietly. There was a legal system, courts, sheriffs, and county records. But the law as it operated in the mountain hollows wasn't always the same law as it appeared in the statute books. Everyone understood this, and most people preferred it that way. The farmhouse itself was a log and stone construction common to the region. 2 main rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above reached by a ladder, a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the kitchen, and a large central fireplace built from fieldstone that served as the house's primary heat source through brutal Appalachian winters. Winters in Harlan County in the mid-19th century were serious. Not the kind of cold that inconveniences, but the kind that kills livestock, splits wood left unattended on the porch, and drives temperatures inside unheated rooms below freezing by midnight. The fireplace wasn't decorative. It was the heart of the house in the most literal sense, and everything inside was arranged in relation to it. The farm had been established sometime in the early 1840s by a man named Absalom Cornett, who came south from Letcher County with his wife, Margaret, and 2 younger brothers whose names appear as co-signatories in deed records, but who vanished from the county's official documentation within 5 years of the property's establishment. There's no definitive explanation for their disappearance. They may have moved to other counties. They may have died. Whatever happened, they don't reappear in Harlan County records after 1847, and neither Absalom nor Margaret ever explained their absence to anyone who committed the explanation to paper. Absalom Cornett wasn't, by surviving accounts, a remarkable man. He paid his taxes without dispute. He attended the Baptist congregation at Clover Fork regularly enough to be considered a member in good standing. Not a zealot, but present, which in that community carried its own weight. He had a reputation among his neighbors as a careful farmer and a fair trader. Someone you could deal with and not feel cheated afterward, which was the highest praise available in a community where most transactions were conducted on trust and handshakes. His word, people said, was the kind that stuck. His wife, Margaret, née Bray, came from a family that had been in Letcher County since before the Revolution, and she brought to the marriage a practicality several contemporaries noted in letters and diaries. She was described in one such letter, written by a neighboring woman, Celia Fugate, to her sister in Virginia, as a woman who doesn't speak unless she has something worth saying, making her words count double. A separate account from the diary of a circuit riding preacher who visited the county in the 1850s described her as a woman of evident intelligence, who carries herself with a reserve that might be mistaken for coldness by those who don't look carefully enough. She wasn't cold. The subsequent history of the Cornett farm makes this abundantly clear. She was careful. There's a significant difference, and it matters enormously to what follows. The couple had 3 children who survived to adulthood: a son, Hiram, born in 1844, and 2 daughters, Lavinia and Ruth, born in 1847 and 1851, respectively. By the time the Civil War came to Kentucky in earnest, and in Harlan County it came hard, with loyalties split down the middle in ways that persisted as a source of violence long after the official fighting stopped. Absalom Cornett was in his mid-50s, too old for active service, but not old enough to be exempt from the consequences of a war that treated geography as an affront and turned neighbors into enemies without much warning. Hiram, old enough to fight, didn't. The record of why is unclear. There was a period of illness noted in a county medical ledger. A fever sometime in the winter of 1861 that seems to have kept him at the farm during the period when most young men his age were choosing sides. By the time the fever passed, the county's military situation had grown complicated enough that a young man with a farm to manage and elderly parents to care for could, with some difficulty, stay put. Whether that difficulty was genuine or manufactured is a question the surviving record doesn't answer. What the record does answer, or begins to answer, is what was happening at the Cornett farm during the years when the war made the county dangerous. The first documented mention of anything unusual appears in a letter written in October 1863 by a home guard lieutenant named Josiah Hensley, responsible for monitoring movement along the Poor Fork corridor during a period of intense guerrilla activity. Hensley's letter, addressed to his commanding officer in Barberville, was a routine patrol report, the kind that accumulates in military archives, by the thousands dry, descriptive, written in the clipped style of a man who commits to paper only what he can't avoid. But buried in the middle of the third paragraph is an observation that doesn't fit the routine character of the rest. The patrol had passed within a quarter-mile of the Cornett property on a cold, overcast morning and observed smoke rising from the chimney at an hour when the household shouldn't yet have been awake, well before dawn. The letter specifies not the tentative gray of earliest morning, but the full dark of 2 or 3 in the morning, when even the most industrious farm household wouldn't yet have started its fire. The smoke rose steadily, not from a fire just lit, but with the settled density of a blaze that had been going some time. This detail would be unremarkable on its own. People wake early in farming households, especially in cold weather, especially when livestock need tending. Fires are started for any number of reasons in the small hours, and a man patrolling a creek valley in October 1863 had larger concerns than his neighbors' sleep schedules. But Hensley's letter continues. 2 of his men, pausing to observe the property from the tree line, reported hearing sounds from inside the house, muffled, as though someone were moving heavy objects across a stone floor. The sounds lasted about 20 minutes and then stopped entirely with a completeness one soldier found more unsettling than the sounds themselves. The way a forest goes quiet when something is moving through it, and the quiet feels like information. When the household stirred at a normal hour, shortly after dawn, nothing appeared out of order. Absalom Cornett came out to see to his livestock at the usual time. His son, Hiram, split wood near the barn with the methodical regularity of a man who'd been doing it on the same farm since childhood. There was no indication in the household's daytime behavior that anything had occurred during the night. The fire in the hearth, visible through the window when the door briefly opened, burned at the modest level appropriate to a household beginning its morning. Not the sustained high heat that weeks later Hensley would connect in a private letter to his wife with what he'd seen rising from the chimney in the dark. Hensley noted the observation, not because he thought it significant, but because he'd been instructed to record anything that deviated from the expected pattern of daily life along his patrol route. The deviation was small. He filed it and moved on. What he didn't know, and what wouldn't become clear until decades later, was that the same observation, smoke before dawn, sounds of movement in the night, the household resuming its ordinary routine, as though nothing had interrupted it, was made on at least 6 separate occasions by at least 4 different people, over the war years and the years immediately following. The pattern was there, documented in letters, diaries, and account books spread across the county's paper record, waiting for someone to read them all at once and recognize what they described. A woman named Duvie Napier, who lived half a mile downstream and occasionally came to the Cornett place to trade garden vegetables for milk and visit with Margaret in the way neighboring women visited in isolated mountain communities. Practically, purposefully, with news and conversation that served as the main conduit of information across the hollow. Mentioned in a letter to her daughter that she'd twice arrived at the farm very early in the morning and found signs the fire had been burning through the night. Ash that didn't match a fire lit at dawn. A hearthstone still warm in a way that suggested hours of sustained heat, rather than the modest morning blaze she could see at the time. And wood smoke smell in the main room, clinging to curtains and furniture, with a persistence that spoke of hours of burning, not minutes. Duvie Napier hadn't asked Margaret about it. She'd noticed it, cataloged it in the private ledger women of her time, and place kept in their minds for information that might someday matter, and said nothing. I did not think it was my place to ask. She wrote to her daughter in a letter that survived and eventually found its way into county historical records. And Margaret did not offer, and we went on talking about the garden and about Ruth's cough, which had been worrying her all month. A traveling Methodist preacher named Orville Tate recorded in his circuit diary under an entry dated March 1865 that he'd spent a night at the Cornett farmhouse during a cold snap and had been disturbed from sound sleep by sounds he couldn't identify. Not the ordinary settling of log house in cold air. Not the sounds of animals shifting in the barn or the creak of a loft ladder, but something he described with apparent discomfort as a kind of rhythmic dragging, persistent, below floor level. It lasted, he estimated, the better part of an hour, and then stopped as abruptly as it began, replaced by a silence that somehow felt different from what came before. Denser, more deliberate. He said nothing to his hosts in the morning, he wrote, because he couldn't be sure it hadn't been a dream, and because the Cornetts were generous people who'd given him supper and a warm place to sleep at no charge. He didn't want to seem ungrateful by implying something in their house had disturbed his rest. But he wrote it down. That was the thing about Orville Tate. He was a man who wrote things down, and the writing down meant they survived. The last documented wartime observation came from a source that might seem unlikely, a Confederate irregular named Wade Sizemore, captured near Clover Fork in the summer of 1864, who during subsequent interrogation by Home Guard officers made a reference to the Cornett farm that the interrogating officer noted but didn't follow up on. Sizemore had been moving through the county collecting intelligence about Union sympathizers and their activities. And in that work, he developed a conviction that the farm on Poor Fork was being used for something beyond ordinary farming. He couldn't specify what. He'd observed lights moving at odd hours. He'd once heard voices, low, brief, quickly hushed, from within the farmhouse at a time, when he'd counted the household members visible through the window and found the count too low to account for everyone who must be inside. But he had no evidence of a specific offense, and the Home Guard officers were more interested in his military activities than his suspicions about a farm in a hollow. The reference was noted, and the conversation moved on. The war ended. The silence that follows large-scale violence is never as quiet as it sounds from a distance. In Harlan County, the years after Appomattox were marked by the kinds of violence official histories tend to categorize as lawlessness, but the people who lived through it understood as the continuation of wartime grievances by other means. Old scores settled. Old alliances frayed. Men who had fought on different sides found themselves neighbors again, and the adjustment wasn't always peaceful. There were shootings, burnings, men who disappeared into the mountains and were never looked for very hard, because everyone understood, on some level, why they'd gone. It was in this atmosphere, charged, suspicious, memories long and grudges longer, that the Cornett farmhouse passed through its most consequential period. And it was in this period that a man named Clarence Duff entered the story. Duff wasn't from Harlan County. He'd come down from Pike County sometime in the early 1870s, drawn by the prospect of work and, some said, by the particular anonymity a man can find in a community where he has no history. He was somewhere in his mid-30s when he arrived. A wary, watchful man with calloused hands and eyes people described as the kind that measured things. He had a trady stonemason and competent carpenter, which made him immediately useful in a county neglected during the war years and working through a backlog of repairs peacetime hadn't yet resolved. He rented a room from a widow named Sally Gentry in the settlement at Clover Fork, kept to himself in the way strangers do when trying to establish a reputation for reliability rather than sociability, and found work quickly. His manner wasn't unfriendly. People who dealt with him on work found him capable and honest. He gave what he said. He would in the time he said it would take. And he didn't pad his accounts. But something about him prevented easy intimacy, a quality of held backness some found merely reserved and others found evasive, depending on their disposition and their antenna for the distance some men carry. He attended church irregularly. He didn't drink, which in the 1870s was unusual enough to be noted. He had no visible connections to anyone in the county before his arrival, and in the years he spent there, he formed no close friendships anyone could identify. His connection to the Cornett farm began in the spring of 1873, when Absalom Cornett, by then in his mid-60s, slowing visibly, increasingly dependent on hired labor, contracted with Duff to repair the farmhouse's stone foundation on the eastern wall, which had settled unevenly over 30 years and was pulling away from the main structure. The work was expected to take 2 weeks. It took 6. Duff's extended presence was explained at the time by the extent of the damage, and several days of steady rain that made certain tasks impossible. Neither explanation was false, but neither was complete. What wasn't explained, and became a subject of considerable retrospective interest, was why Absalom Cornett paid Duff not purely in cash, the usual arrangement, but in a combination of currency and something that appeared in no invoice and left no clear paper trail. Duff's own account ledger, recovered after his death, contains an entry for the Cornett job, with a notation, written in different ink, and a slightly different hand, as though added after the original bookkeeping. It reads, "Consideration received," followed by an amount and the abbreviation AGR, which may have stood for agreement, or something more specific the abbreviation was designed to obscure. The extended presence at the farm, the unusual payment, and the notation designed to record something without describing it. These details would have meant nothing in isolation. Men were paid in unusual ways for unusual work, all the time in a county where cash wasn't abundant and debts were settled in kind. But then came the return visits. Between 1873 and 1879, Clarence Duff made at least 11 documented return visits to the Cornett farmhouse. Documented because people saw him on the road and remembered, because the road along Poor Fork carried light enough traffic that a man on horseback was an event worth noting, because several of Duff's neighbors at the Gentry boarding house recalled him being absent for days at a stretch during this period and returning without explanation. 11 visits over 6 years, each unexplained, and each followed by Duff's resumption of his ordinary life in Clover Fork, as though nothing had interrupted it. Absalom Cornett. When asked by a neighbor named Albert Souder about Duff's repeated appearances, said only that there were ongoing repairs. The farm always had something needing fixing, which was true of every farm in the county, and Duff was reliable with stonework. The explanation was plausible, the kind a man gives when he has the right answer, and also a true answer, and has chosen to offer the true one because it will serve the same purpose. Souder accepted it at the time. He was a man who did not startle easily. Souder recalled later, giving an account to a county official during a legal proceeding tangentially related to the Cornett family. But when I asked him, once, direct, what Duff was helping him with, there was something in his face I had not seen before. Not fear, exactly. More like the look a man gets when he is carrying something heavier than he wants anyone to know, and someone has asked him a question that comes too close to the weight of it. The observation stayed in the courthouse record, to be read decades later, by others who would understand it differently. Absalom Cornett died in February 1879 during a winter that killed livestock across the county and left the ground too frozen to dig graves until March. His death was attributed to pneumonia, not uncommon among older men in the mountains in a hard winter, when cold settled into lungs weakened by decades of work in damp, drafty conditions. It wasn't considered suspicious, and no surviving evidence suggests it was anything other than what it appeared. He was buried in the family plot on the hillside above the farm in early March, in a service attended by perhaps 30 neighbors and the minister from Clover Fork. Margaret outlived him by 7 years, staying at the farm with Hiram, who never left home, and managed the agricultural work, while his mother continued managing what she'd always managed: the household, the relationships, the invisible infrastructure of trust and obligation that held the family's position in the community together. When Margaret died in 1886, the farm passed to Hiram, by then in his early 40s. A taciturn man who'd spent most of his adult life working the same land his father had cleared, and who seemed to approach the inheritance with something more complicated than simple grief. Something that looked, to the more perceptive of his neighbors, like the expression of a man who has accepted a burden he didn't fully choose, and doesn't yet know whether he'll be strong enough to carry it as it needs to be carried. It was Hiram Cornett who hired Elias Prout and his crew in the winter of 1887, and it was Hiram who gave Prout what appeared to be a straightforward assignment: repair and repoint the farmhouse's main fireplace, which had developed cracks after 2 hard freezes. The kind of cracking that spreads season to season if unaddressed, and eventually compromises the entire structure. He then left the property entirely for 3 days, without leaving a forwarding address, which was unusual. Hiram had rarely spent a night away from that farm in his adult life. His neighbors noticed his absence and assumed it was a family matter, not pressing. When Prout's crew began removing the damaged stones from the fireplace's back wall, they expected to find rubble infill and clay beneath, standard construction of the period, practical and uninteresting. Instead, behind a section of wall, demonstrably newer than the surrounding stonework, they found an opening to a passage. And everything that followed, the refusal, the statement, the mislaid folder, the decades of disconnected observation, began from that moment. The passage, as Prout described in his county clerk's statement, was about 30 inches wide and perhaps 5 feet tall at its entrance, generous enough for a grown person to enter, while crouching and moving sideways. but not built for comfort. The stones lining its walls were fitted without mortar. Dry, stacked in the manner used for cellars and root pits throughout the region, but with a precision suggesting they'd been placed by someone who knew what they were doing. Not rough fieldstone thrown together in a hurry, but courses laid with care, larger stones at the base and smaller above, the way a skilled mason constructs a wall intended to last generations. The floor was compacted earth, tamped flat and smooth in a way that required effort. The kind you invest in a floor, expected to be used repeatedly. The ceiling, where Prout could make it out in lamplight, was not stone but timber-heavy beams set close together, packed above with clay and small stones to support the weight of the floor above, without creating the hollow sound that might give away the passage's existence to anyone walking through the room. Someone had thought carefully about every aspect of the construction. Nothing had been left to chance. The passage descended at an angle, Prout noted, as if designed to pass beneath the frost line, below the level where winter temperatures could cause the ground to shift and heave, where a poorly built underground space would crack and collapse. He estimated the angle at roughly 15 degrees from horizontal, though he'd not descended far enough to be certain. The passage continued into darkness beyond the reach of their lantern, swallowing light at perhaps 30 feet and offering nothing back but a faint current of cool air one man described as the same air you get when opening a cellar shut up for a long time. Close and cold, carrying the smell of earth and stone. At roughly 10 feet in, they found the marks on the left wall. Prout's statement described them as vertical scratches cut into the stone with a tool. Not hastily scratched, but carved with deliberate pressure, intended to be permanent. They were grouped in sets of 5 in the traditional tali fashion, 4 vertical lines and a diagonal cross stroke to make the 5th. The same system anyone keeping account over time would use. They repeated at intervals of roughly 18 inches along the wall. Prout counted from near the entrance, lantern held forward, at least 7 complete sets before darkness made further counting impossible. 30, 5 marks minimum, possibly more. Probably more. Given the depth of the passage and the deliberateness with which everything else had been constructed. He and his men stood at the entrance looking in, saying nothing for a while. Later Prout would describe this moment as the point he made a decision, not conscious or articulated, not the kind where you weigh options and choose, but more like the kind where your body has already arrived at its conclusion before your mind catches up. His men weren't going further. He wasn't going further. Whatever was down there, whatever had been carved on that wall and why, was something Elias Prout and his crew weren't equipped to understand. And the specific quality of their not understanding made it important that someone who might understand be told. Which is why he filed the statement. Which is why, despite the statement being subsequently mislaid, the story didn't entirely disappear. It lived in the mouths of his men in the way things, seen together, are always shared more widely than things seen alone. Traveling through the hollow to Clover Fork, and wherever roads and conversations carried it. Hiram Cornett returned to the farm on the 3rd day after the discovery. He arrived late morning on horseback alone, and spoke with Prout in the farmyard with a quietness and steadiness Prout later described as the quality he remembered most clearly about the whole episode. Not anger, not distress, not flustered embarrassment, just a kind of settled acknowledgement, as though Hiram had spent those 3 days reaching an agreement with himself about what was going to happen next, and had arrived back already at peace with it. He thanked Prout for stopping work. A detail the foreman found strange, the thanking, as though stopping had been a courtesy offered, rather than a refusal forced. He paid the crew generously for the days worked and dismissed them without further conversation. He asked Prout, before he left, whether he'd filed any documentation with the county. Prout said yes. Hiram nodded slowly, as though the answer confirmed something he already knew. He said nothing more about it. He then sealed the passage entrance himself, using new mortar and stones from a pile of rubble behind the barn. Material sitting there long enough to be weathered, so it wouldn't look conspicuously new if you weren't looking for it. The work took most of an afternoon. A neighboring boy who'd come to the farm on an errand from his mother stood at the yard fence for the better part of an hour watching him do it, with the frank curiosity of an 11-year-old who doesn't yet understand. There are things being witnessed that won't become comprehensible for 60 years. That boy was Monroe Begley. He would work the coal mines when they came to the county, work them most of his adult life, and carry the image of Hiram sealing that fireplace wall through it all. When he finally gave an account to a local historian in the late 1930s, he described Hiram's manner with a precision suggesting the image had never faded. He worked the way a man works when he is not thinking about the work. The hands know what to do and the mind is somewhere else. He mixed the mortar and he laid the stones, and he pressed them into place. And he never once stepped back to look at what he was doing, the way a craftsman would. He already knew what it looked like. He was doing something that didn't need looking at. He was finishing something. And then Begley said the thing that would stay with Horace Cavender for years. The question I always wondered about but never asked, because there was no one left to ask, was whether he sealed it because he wanted to forget, or because he already knew there was nothing left inside that needed tending. Nothing left inside that needed tending. The phrase carried weight Begley may not have fully intended, because to say nothing needed tending implied that something had needed tending before. That the passage hadn't simply been a construction, an artifact, a piece of hidden architecture, but an active thing, a living thing in a sense, something requiring maintenance and attention and care over time, something people had used and returned to and used again. What had been done in that passage? What had been counted on that wall? The answers weren't coming easily, and they weren't coming from the passage itself. Hiram had seen to that. They were going to have to come from somewhere else. From paper, from memory, from the particular willingness to sit with partial information long enough for the parts to arrange themselves into something coherent. They began to come slowly from a physician named Dr. Samuel Reardon. Dr. Reardon arrived in Harlan County in 1891, 4 years after Prout's discovery. He'd been hired by a mining company, one of several then beginning to consolidate land and mineral rights in preparation for large-scale coal extraction, to conduct a survey of general health conditions in several Harlan County communities. The coal operators had learned from experience in other mining regions that local health had direct implications for their ability to recruit and retain labor, and they wanted to know what they were working with before committing resources. Dr. Reardon was thorough, methodical, and possessed the particular gift that distinguishes good physicians from merely competent ones: the ability to listen to what people tell him and hear beneath the words what they aren't quite saying. He had a manner people described as non-threatening, not warm, exactly, not the bedside warmth some physicians deploy as a professional tool, but a quality of genuine attention that made people feel what they said mattered to him, would be remembered, handled with respect. In a community where outsiders were viewed with deep suspicion, this was no small thing. In the course of his survey, Dr. Reardon interviewed dozens of residents, recording accounts of past illnesses, injuries, and deaths with a systematic completeness most rural counties had never attempted. He asked about epidemics, infant mortality, chronic conditions, mountain life, produced in people who worked outdoors, in all weather, for decades. He asked about diet and water, and diseases that followed mining operations. He was building a picture, and he needed data. It was in this capacity that he first encountered, in a conversation with an elderly woman named Priscilla Bolin, a piece of the Cornett story, never committed to official record. Priscilla Bolin was in her late 60s when Dr. Reardon visited, putting her birth in the 1820s, old enough to have adult memories of the antebellum period, old enough to have lived through the war as a woman who understood what she was watching. She'd been born in the county, lived her entire life within 5 miles of Poor Fork, known every family along the creek bottom for 60 years. When she decided to tell Dr. Reardon what she knew, she didn't approach indirectly or frame it as a memory or rumor. She told him she had something to say she hadn't said in many years, and she said it. During the war period and the years before it, she told him, the Cornett farm had been known among a certain group of people. She was careful describing this group, using the phrase, people who had reason to move carefully, as a place where assistance could be obtained. She didn't initially specify the nature of the assistance. She said she'd known of at least 3 individuals who had come to the Cornett farm under specific circumstances and hadn't been seen again in the county afterward. In some cases, this was the intended outcome, and their families understood and were grateful. In other cases, she was less certain of the outcome, and that uncertainty had stayed with her across the decades since. Dr. Reardon asked directly, what kind of assistance? She was quiet a moment. Then she said that during the 1850s and into the war years, a person could sometimes need to move through the Kentucky mountains in ways the law wouldn't permit, and the wrong neighbors wouldn't tolerate. The Cornett farm was a place where such movement was made possible for a period of years by people who decided certain things mattered more than the legal arrangements of the time. She'd known this and kept it and been keeping it for 30 years. Dr. Reardon recorded this account in his survey notes, careful and precise, preserving her exact words where he could and paraphrasing where he couldn't. He didn't, at that point, connect it to any specific physical feature of the Cornett farm. He hadn't heard of Elias Pruitt's discovery 4 years earlier. He noted it as an example of wartime social networks that had existed throughout eastern Kentucky. Networks that moved information, goods, and people under difficult and dangerous conditions, adding a brief editorial observation that the isolation of mountain hollows had made such networks simultaneously more necessary and more sustainable than they might have been in more accessible terrain. He filed the survey with the mining company. The survey was filed in company records. The records were never returned to the county. But Dr. Reardon kept his own copy of the notes. The second major piece came from Clarence Duff himself, or rather, from what remained of his papers when he died in 1894, alone in a boarding house in Peenaville. Duff had never married, never acquired property of significance. He'd spent his final years in declining health, working occasional masonry jobs, increasingly beyond his physical capacity, accepting charity with the particular quiet dignity of a man who'd spent a lifetime self-sufficient and found dependence, a more difficult adjustment than illness. He died without family, without friends in any conventional sense, without anyone to sort through his belongings and decide what mattered. His papers, the account ledger, a small bundle of letters, and a notebook that appeared to be a kind of personal journal. were claimed by no one, and eventually passed in the possession of a schoolteacher named Horace Cavender, who had been friendly with Duff in his last years, drawn by the sense that there was something worth knowing beneath the surface that would never be offered voluntarily. Cavender had recognized, even before Duff's death, that the older man was carrying something. He hadn't known what. When the papers came to him, he began to find out. The account ledger was, on its surface, a straightforward business record: dates, amounts, names of clients, brief descriptions of work. It covered roughly 30 years, from shortly after Duff's arrival in Pike County through his last working years. The kind of document a careful, methodical man produces over a lifetime, containing, if you read it closely enough, the shape of an entire existence in its entries and omissions. Cavender read it closely, over many evenings, with a lamp tilted to illuminate the handwriting and margins. What he eventually found wasn't in the entries themselves, but in the pattern of entries and the spaces between them. The pattern of Duff's work life showed a man who took on jobs, completed them, and moved on, except for the 6-year period from 1873 to 1879, during which a single client appeared repeatedly, 11 times, for services the ledger described in terms vague enough to be meaningless. 11 return visits to a single client over 6 years for work Duff apparently couldn't or wouldn't specify in his own private account book. The consideration received. Notation, the abbreviation that might have meant agreement or something else. It wasn't evidence of anything specific. It was a shape in the data, a pattern that didn't match surrounding patterns. And Horace Cavender had been a schoolteacher long enough to know that when a pattern breaks, the break is often the thing worth studying. The notebook was harder to read. Duff's handwriting, always cramped and inconsistent, deteriorated significantly in his later years, and entire pages were nearly illegible without strong light and considerable patience. But Cavender had patience. It was perhaps his defining quality as both a teacher and as what he was slowly becoming, an investigator of sorts, a private historian, a man who'd stumbled into a mystery that didn't yet have a name. What he eventually found in the notebook, across months of careful reading, was a series of dated entries corresponding almost exactly to the 11 return visits in the ledger. The entries were brief, written in compressed notation meant for Duff's own use, containing directions, geographic directions specific to local landmarks Cavender recognized, and time estimates, and what appeared to be the number of stops on a route, expressed as numerals without further explanation. In several entries, a notation appeared to be a count. Numbers written at the end in different ink, sometimes with a plus sign followed by a smaller number, as though adding to a running total. Cavender reconstructed the running total as best he could from legible entries. The total at the end of the last entry he could date was somewhere in the high 80s or low 90s. He couldn't be certain. The handwriting was poor and the ink faded. But the implication of a running total, a number being maintained, added to across visits, tracking something accumulating over time, was clear enough. And then there was the notation in the last legible entry from sometime in 1878 or possibly early 1879, written not in Duff's usual cramped hand, but in a version somehow both smaller and more careful, as though the writer had taken unusual care with what he was writing. The notation read only, "The end wall, MC her mark. Let it stand. C. Margaret Cornett. Her mark. Let it stand." Cavender sat with this a long time before he began to understand what it meant. And just when he thought the picture was complete, just when the ledger, the notebook, Dr. Reardon's survey notes, and Priscilla Boland's account had assembled themselves into something coherent, he encountered a document that forced him to revise almost everything A letter misfiled among county tax records from the late 1870s, written in the careful, precise cursive of a woman who had learned to write in an era when female literacy was not universal and was therefore something she had worked for. Written in October 1877, addressed to a person identified only by initials, 2 initials, first and last. Chavender spent weeks trying to match to any name in county records, without success. Postmarked from a town in Ohio he recognized as sitting on the northern bank of the Ohio River, directly across from the Kentucky shore. The letter made clear something that overturned Cavender's chronology. Entirely, the passage had not been built in 1873, as Duff's notebook implied. Duff had extended something that already existed. The original construction was older, significantly older. And the marks on the wall, the tally marks Elias Prout had assumed were a laborer's rough record, had not begun during the Reconstruction era, but during the war itself. No, earlier than that. The count that we began in the old cellar. Margaret Cornett wrote in the measured prose of a woman choosing every word with care, was moved to the lower passage when the lower passage was made and continues there now, kept in the same fashion by the same hand as it was from the beginning. There are those who would call such keeping a vanity. I call it what it is, the only monument that was possible and the only one that was wanted. The only monument that was possible and the only one that was wanted. Cavender read the sentence 3 times before reaching for his pen. The woman who could explain it was named Hattie Farler. She was in her late 80s when Cavender found her, or rather, when she found him. Having heard through the communication network of an isolated mountain community that someone was asking questions about the Cornett place, the passage and the marks, and Clarence Duff's return visits. She sent word through an intermediary that she would speak with him. He rode 12 miles through a December cold that turned his breath to vapor in front of his face and made the road slick in shaded sections where the sun hadn't reached since autumn. She lived at the head of a creek called Martin's Fork, in a small house with the settled, organic quality of a building never separated from the person who occupies it, smelling of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the mineral smell of stone walls in cold weather. She was seated close to the fire when he arrived, wrapped in a quilt, with the stillness of a very old person who has learned to conserve energy the way a fire conserves itself in a low burn. Contained, steady, nothing wasted. She didn't ask him what he knew. She asked him what he thought he knew. And then she listened to his account with an expression that shifted once, slightly, when he mentioned the count in Duff's notebook, then settled back into a composure he read as the expression of a woman who had been deciding for many years whether to have this conversation and had finally decided. "You have most of it," she said. "Not all of it. The part you are missing is the beginning." The beginning, she told him, was not Clarence Duff, and it was not 1873, and it was not even the Civil War. The beginning was Margaret Cornett, and it was the late 1840s. And it was a decision Margaret had made before the farmhouse on Poor Fork was more than a few years old. Margaret Bray had grown up in Letcher County in a family that straddled the particular moral geography of eastern Kentucky in the antebellum period. Not slaveholders themselves, not poor enough to be entirely outside the slave economy, but connected by geography and trade to both the institution and to the complex of people who opposed it. She had grown up knowing that certain things were done. Rather, she had grown up knowing that certain people moved through the mountains in ways that required assistance, and that assistance was given by those willing to give it at personal risk and without public acknowledgement. When she married Absalom Cornett and moved to the Poor Fork farm in the early 1840s, She arrived with an understanding of what the farm's location made possible, and a very clear intention about what she was going to do with that possibility. Absalom was not, she later told Hattie, unwilling, but he was not the originator, the operation. And it is appropriate to use that word, because it had the organization and sustained deliberateness of an operation rather than an impulse. Was Margaret's conception, Margaret's planning, and Margaret's maintenance across the years that followed. The root cellar behind the kitchen had been the first hiding place. Already there, when they arrived, standard construction, unremarkable. Margaret assessed it within the first season and saw in it what a person with her particular state of mind sees in such spaces, not storage, but possibility, not a cellar, but a room with a door that locked from the outside and a depth that held steady at 52 degrees year, round, and a location behind the hill not visible from the road. The first person came through in the summer of 1849. Hattie didn't know the details. Margaret told her only that it had happened. Arranged through the network she'd established before ever moving to Poor Fork, a network stretching north toward Ohio and south toward Tennessee, operating on absolute trust and absolute silence. The root cellar was used, and the person passed through and continued north. When they were gone, Margaret took a nail and made a mark in the cellar wall, not from drama, not from sentimentality, but from the same practical cast of mind that made her note everything that mattered and record it in whatever way was available. The mark was a record. The person had been here. The person had passed through. Over the next decade and a half, the marks accumulated, not rapidly. This wasn't an operation that moved hundreds of people a season. It was careful, irregular, organized around the specific circumstances of individuals and the current danger level on various routes. Some years there were many marks. Some years, none. The count that accumulated was, in Margaret's own words in the letter Cavender had found, a monument, the only kind available to a woman operating in total secrecy, acknowledging the passage of people whose names could not be written, whose movement could not be documented, whose survival depended on the absence of any record connecting them to this place. When Clarence Duff came to the farm in 1873, he came for a specific purpose, to build the passage. The root cellar had become insufficient. The war had changed the county in ways that made old arrangements precarious. Reconstruction hadn't ended the danger. In some ways, it had intensified it, because the legal status of people who had been enslaved was now being contested through new mechanisms, by people with resources and institutional support. The network had continued operating after the war because the need continued, and the need required better infrastructure. Duff had been recruited through the same network. His history before Pike County was something he'd never shared, and not something Hattie Farler could speak to in detail. But his willingness to come, to do the work quietly, to accept payment in a form that was partly money and partly the silent understanding people in such networks exchange when money is insufficient. This she knew. He built the passage, and he built it well, and he came back 11 times across 6 years to maintain it and to serve when needed as a guide along the routes the passage connected to. The last time anyone used it, Hattie said, was in the early 1880s. Margaret was still alive. She counted them in herself. She said afterward that she counted because she wanted the number to be exact. She didn't want to approximate what had been done. She wanted the record to be accurate. Cavender asked the question he'd been building toward for years. How many marks are there? At the end of the passage, up in the section Prout's lantern didn't reach. Hattie Farler was quiet a moment. The fire shifted, settling lower, and shadows rearranged themselves. I was inside it once, she said. Margaret took me in the late 1870s. She wanted someone else to have seen it. She wanted a witness. I counted. She told him, 112 complete tally marks, 22 complete groups of 5, and 2 additional marks that had not yet reached the 5th. The count, in other words, was still open when the passage was sealed, still waiting for a cross stroke that would never come, because the passage was closed before it arrived. 112 people. Cavender sat very still. 112 people who had moved through the root cellar, and then through the passage of the Cornett farmhouse on Poor Fork, between the late 1840s and the early 1880s, in circumstances requiring concealment, whose continued existence required that they not be remembered in any way connecting them to this particular hollow in Harlan County, Kentucky. Why did they seal it? He asked. Why did Margaret finally seal it? She didn't, Hattie said. That was Hiram. After she died, he decided the risk had passed, or maybe he decided he couldn't carry it the way she had. I don't know which, maybe both. He sealed it, and then he hired the mason, and then he left for 3 days, because he couldn't watch someone break open what his mother had built, even if the breaking open wasn't that. And the name, Cavender said. Duff's notebook mentioned a name carved at the end of the passage, a mark different from the others. Hattie looked at him for a long moment. Then she described it, a woman's name, first name only, cut in careful letters 1/2 inch tall at the very end of the passage wall, where the passage terminated at a stone face. A name Cavender, recognized as belonging to no one he'd ever found in any county record connected to the Cornett family. A name that stood there at the end of the count, not as a number, but as a person. The person for whom the count had been kept. The person who had been the reason for the first mark on the root cellar wall in the summer of 1849. The first one through. The one who had made the operation possible by demonstrating that it was possible. The one whose passage had convinced Margaret Cornett that what she was doing was worth doing, that the risk and silence and weight of the secret were worth what they produced at the other end of that cold, narrow underground corridor. Cavender didn't ask Hattie to repeat the name. He'd heard it clearly the first time, and as he prepared to leave, mounting his horse in the December cold with his notes inside his coat, where the wind couldn't reach them, he made a decision. He maintained for the rest of his life the name would not go into his record. It had stayed private for 60 years because the people who knew it had decided it should be private. He was not in a position to override that decision. Some things belong to the people who made them, and the archivist's job is not always to surface everything. Sometimes it is to understand what was buried and why, and to let the why stand. Horace Cavender never published anything about the Cornett farmhouse. The notes survived because he gave them, on his death in the early 1920s, to a nephew with a brief written instruction. These belong in an institution that will handle them carefully, and I leave it to you to find one. The nephew, a practical man who didn't share his uncle's antiquarian inclinations, but respected them, took the instruction seriously. The notes passed through several custodians and eventually came to rest in a small local archive in Harlan County, sometime in the mid-20th century, cataloged under a heading that didn't mention the Cornett family by name. By then, the farmhouse itself was gone. The coal industry had come to Poor Fork and reshaped the landscape so completely that the ground where it had stood was unrecognizable. Regraded, rerouted, incorporated into the infrastructure of extraction that had been the county's economic future, since before anyone living there had been born. The passage was gone. The root cellar was gone. The fireplace, the stone walls, the compacted earth floor of the corridor, the timber ceiling beams, the marks, all of it gone. What remained was paper Elias Prout's statement, eventually recovered from county records, Dr. Reardon's survey notes, eventually making their way to a state archive in Frankfurt, Priscilla Boland's account, existing only in Reardon's transcription, Duff's ledger and notebook, preserved almost entirely by Cavender's careful transcription, Cavender's own notes. The reconstruction, the reasoning, the months of patient connection-making, the letter in Margaret Cornett's hand from October 1877, misfiled among tax records, rewriting Cavender's chronology, cannot now be located. Whether removed deliberately, lost in one of the archive's moves, or destroyed, no one knows. Cavender's transcription of its key passages is the only evidence it existed. Hiram Cornett died in 1903, the last of Absalom and Margaret's children to survive. He had never married. He farmed the Poor Fork land until mining companies began buying mineral rights, then sold and moved to a town further up the county, living out his final years in a boarding house, not unlike the one where Clarence Duff had died 9 years earlier. He left no papers. If he kept a journal or wrote letters containing anything about what he knew, they haven't been found. He was buried in the same hillside plot as his parents, in the years before coal operations, reached that section of the hollow, and changed everything around the graves without disturbing them. The count was 1 as Hattie Farler told Cavender, 112 people who passed through the root cellar, and then the passage across more than 30 years in circumstances requiring absolute concealment. 112 marks on a wall that no longer exists. The 112 people whose destinations weren't recorded, whose subsequent lives cannot be traced to this particular hollow, who entered the passage carrying whatever they carried and emerged somewhere on the other side of the Kentucky mountains into whatever came next. Whether they found what they were looking for is not a question the Cornett farmhouse's history can answer. The marks recorded their passage, not their destination or fate. Each mark said only, someone was here, someone passed through, someone was counted. The silence surrounding the operation, deliberate, sustained, multi-generational, was not, as has sometimes been assumed about such silences, born of shame. It was the silence of protection, for the people moved through the passage, some of whom might still have been vulnerable decades after it was sealed. Protection for the network and the people at other points along the routes, who had taken the same risks and were owed the same discretion. Protection for the operation itself against the retrospective judgment of a post-war society still, in many legal and social arrangements, working out what it actually believed about what had been done and who had the right to do it. Margaret Cornett chose the record over the recognition. She understood, perhaps from the beginning, from the moment she put the first mark on the root cellar wall in the summer of 1849. That recognition was not possible and was not the point. The marks were not for posterity, not for history. They were for the count itself, for the accuracy of the count, for the fact of 112 being exactly 112 and not an approximation. They were, as she had written in the letter Cavender found, and no one can now find, the only monument that was possible, and the only one that was wanted. And then there is the name at the end of the wall, the name Horace Cavender heard from Hattie Farler on a December afternoon at the head of Martin's Fork, and chose not to record, and died with both of them. It is possible that someone, somewhere, knows that name. It is possible that among the descendants of the 112, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of the people who passed through the Cornett Passage and continued north, who built lives in Ohio and Indiana and points further, who carried with them the memory or the story or simply the fact of their survival. Someone knows where it began, knows the name of the farm on Poor Fork, has heard in some form the account of the fireplace, the passage, and the woman who counted. It is also possible that they do not, and that the connection between that first mark in 1849 and everything that followed was severed precisely as intended. Completely, cleanly, with nothing trailing behind to endanger anyone. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything about the Cornett farmhouse has been uncovered? Or are there layers still unrevealed? Do you think Margaret Cornett made the right choice, giving up recognition for safety? Leave your comment below. These are the conversations history deserves and almost never gets. If this story stayed with you, if you want more dark chapters of American history told this way without the comfort of easy answers, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who understands that the most disturbing stories are the ones that could have actually happened. And very often did. We'll see you in the next one.